And we should be live.
It says that.
We are. We are live. So welcome, gentle listeners, friends, nobles, ladies, lords, whoever we have listening in on us today. My name is Rand Brown, or as I've been known on in RCH for quite some time by my nom de plume, Strider. And today we have a very special presentation for you all. Joining us is our longtime contributor and very, very dear friend, Dr. Andrew Latham from Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota. Andrew, thank you so much for being here with us, and thanks for being here.
It's a very great pleasure.
So a little bit by way of introduction, obviously you teach international relations at Macalester College. You're very well written on a wide variety of topics that don't just include the medieval period. And you've been contributing here on Real Crusades history for quite a while now. I want to say at least 5 years now.
Yeah,
that you've been associated with us. Yeah, 5-6 years, I think.
Yeah.
And not only that, but more near and dear to my heart, you're also representing the veteran community, as you were a former corporal in Her Majesty's Royal Canadian Lawrence Scots Highlander Regiment, and that's it's always nice to have that demographic represented as well in academia, despite it being a minority.
Well, I'll tell you, at Macalester, there's 160 full-time tenure track faculty. 3 of us have any military experience. One is a retired major, the other one a retired sergeant, and me, a lowly corporal.
But, as we like to say in the Marine Corps, corporals run the service. So there's also that.
A strategic corporal.
A strategic corporal, yeah, that's right. Or as we like to say, Chevron power.
Yeah.
So we'll get right into this. But for all our listeners out there, feel free to tune in whenever. Hopefully, we're not keeping anybody too up late or early from whichever time zone you're joining us from. Yeah, we'll jump right into this. So, Dr. Latham, if you could just very briefly just give us kind of your background, your professional academic background, what you've done in the past, what you are currently doing, and what brings you up here to today.
Well, to make a long and to me very interesting, but not to anybody else, story short, I have a PhD in international relations, strategic studies to be precise, from a very good Marxist Canadian university. Actually, our little shop wasn't terribly Marxist, but the rest of the university really is. I have been here now in the U.S. at Macalester College. It's my first job out of grad school. Been here for 23 years. And have been teaching very, very talented undergraduate students things about some enduring realities of international politics, which we'll get into a little bit later. Not just about the medieval era. I teach mostly medieval political theory, which I enjoy enormously. But I teach a number of courses having to do with contemporary geopolitical conflict in the Middle East, in the Indo-Pacific region, in Central and Eastern Europe. One of the joys of teaching at a liberal arts college like Macalester is I don't have to be narrowly super specialized. So I really do geopolitics and strategy across the continents and across the centuries, and that keeps me fresh and makes me happy.
And it's very interesting to hear you talk about those things, because in my own personal background, I too did not start with the medieval period. I was actually, my undergraduate was political science, and I actually did specialize in international relations and grand strategy before I, as I like to say it, I jumped ship.
Yeah.
And delved into military history, specifically the medieval period, military history of the medieval era. So it's, you know, it's interesting to hear, to talk to someone like you who is still in that world academically.
Well, I have a foot in both worlds, and maybe this is a question that will come up, but as an undergraduate, I did some history courses, and they touched upon various, I was misinformed, I would say, about the medieval era, and then I promptly forgot about it, and I was really focused on contemporary. This is the tail end of the Cold War, the beginning of the post-Cold War era. It was very exciting to be in my line of work. While a grad student, I was working for the Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs in Ottawa. The medieval world was the farthest thing from my mind. And then at one point, very early in my career, I decided I was going to write this grand, not so much history, but historically informed theory of 3 different eras of warfare in the West. And I was going to have a chapter on medieval, and then do a chapter on modern, and then do a chapter on contemporary or late modern, postmodern, whatever we're calling it these days. And I tell you, I started that medieval chapter, and I never finished. My book on medieval geopolitics is the full sort of culmination of what was meant to be a chapter in a very, very different book. I fell in love with the era, and not the simplistic, Hollywood version of it, but the nuance, the alienness of it, the foreignness of it, and yet the familiarity with that part of the world, and with some of the cultural sort of currents that continue into the modern era. And so I have never fully escaped the gravity well of the medieval era. And of course, for me, it wasn't just the medieval era. It was war and conflict in medieval Europe.
That's a fantastic segue into, and as I said, as I told you before, or as I warned you before, I do have your book, Theorizing Medieval Geopolitics, War and the World Order in the Age of the Crusades, published by the Routledge Research and Medieval Studies. Just to all our guests listening, I will make sure and include a link to this particular work, so that if you want to follow along, you can. But as far as everything that I've ever seen, this is sort of your flagship academic work. If I Google Andrew Latham right now, probably one of the very first, probably the entire first page of results that will pop up has to do with this book, has to do with Theorizing Medieval Geopolitics. And I feel like you really struck a nerve, or started a trend in academia with the work that you set out with in this book, specifically analyzing geopolitics, which is very much a more modern academic school of thought, but analyzing the medieval period within the context of geopolitics in ways that modern commentators or postmodern, however we want to call that, would understand. And what I personally find fascinating about that subject is there's not many people who would think that those two topics would go together. Mostly because, as you've said in both in the book, and as I've seen said in many other places, that the concept of the state, as we understand it, is very alien and very different to what existed during the medieval period, and that's a you took on a topic that I think a lot of other people would have found very daunting, and that's so. What essentially my question here would be, what led you to do that?
Well, just kind of a myth-busting impulse. Here's the fairy tale we tell ourselves in the academic field of international relations. International relations began with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. Everything that happened before 1648 is some weird dark ages. It doesn't have any bearing on modernity. We have nothing to learn from it. If we push back far enough to Thucydides in the 5th century BC, okay, that he's part of the canon. But then there's like 1,500 years in which apparently nothing happened politically of any interest to anybody in the field of international relations. Well, and I bought that hook, line, and sinker for most of my early career. It really is the kind of foundational myth for international relations scholars. But then as soon as I started reading the good historiographical work on the Middle Ages, they weren't that dark. If you've been to Chartres Cathedral, for example, in France, you know that wasn't a dark age by any stretch of anybody's imagination. There was lots of interesting stuff going on in the world of political theory, whether it's Augustine at the beginning or Aquinas in the middle. It wasn't as if John Locke and Thomas Hobbes were the first political theorists. With respect to the military and the political, it became very clear to me that the fairy tale that we had been telling ourselves about the birth of the modern era, the sovereign state and the state system and all that, did not happen at midnight on July the 3rd of 1648 or anything like that. Those ideas had a history that went back way before that. I'll talk about my recent book shortly, but it's on this topic as well. And the institutions, the ideas go back way before 1648, the ideas of statehood and sovereignty and supreme power, etc. Even nationalism, which people would say is a 19th century invention. Well, don't tell that to the French or the English, or for that matter, the Scots. Just to name a few off the top of my head. From the 12th to 13th century, they might pick a bone with you about this. So the more I began to kind of peel the onion, as it were, the more layers are there. And I have spent most of my career since I arrived at Macalester, basically, fighting against that conventional wisdom. I've made a little bit of progress, and I have some very good fellow travelers now. But still, if you pick up an international relations textbook today, cutting edge, published this year, it'll start in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia. So some myths are hard to displace.
Yes, they are. As anybody who spends any reasonable amount of time in medieval studies has to deal with all the time, because obviously, the period of history that we are most interested in is characterized as backwards and ignorant, and nobody knew how to wash their hands, and it was
don't forget
superstitious, religious fanatics, nobody, apparently there was no progress of any sort whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
So I can absolutely sympathize with that, but it's fascinating to see the discussion of something as grand and as big blue arrow and 30,000 feet level as geopolitics and international relations being applied to the medieval period. And I guess my next question for you would be, and this is more from where with things that I've read, what characteristics would you say that medieval geopolitics and modern geopolitics, or postmodern, however we want to describe that, mm-hmm. What did they have in common? Where were they different? And what are the conceptual frameworks that you've been working with and have been discussing between those two periods?
Well, I would say that it's more universal than that. I've been reading a lot of Chinese ancient and medieval history recently, and I'm struck by the parallels. And when I mentioned Thucydides writing about the Peloponnesian War, and he got it right in the 5th century BC when he said that there are these international orders. They're populated with, let's call them states. They go by counties or city-states or kingdoms or principalities or emirates or empires, or they go by a lot of different names, but they're all political units that are armed. And what do those armed political units do? As Thucydides said, they are motivated by fear, honor, and interest, right? Fear of the other, of your next door neighbor who's arming to defend themselves, but that looks pretty threatening to you. Honor is status and prestige. Nobody can deny that that's a powerful motivator in human history. And interest is the pursuit of power and wealth. He was right in the 5th century, Thucydides was right in the 5th century BC. That certainly characterizes politics in the medieval time. Now, I make a distinction between early, high, and late medieval, but in the later medieval period, say from the year just arbitrarily 1200 onward, you can see an international system that looks very much like the international system in that part of Europe in 1700, 1800. It looks very much like some of the international orders that you would have found in the Islamic world, that you would find in the Sinocentric, the Chinese world. Those are the similarities, I think. Now, nobody would claim that any of those worlds is exactly like the world we inhabit today, right? Feudalism, which is an overused and tortured concept, but there's something to it about these vassalic chains, lord-vassal chains, etc. Clearly, the ambient kind of cultural framework of Christianity, in the case of what is now Western Europe, in a way that, we now live in a post-Christian world and non-Christian world to a large extent, for better or worse. That shaped the way in which they thought about politics and whatnot. So there are real differences, but it is possible to exaggerate the differences and to make the medieval radically, totally, absolutely different, so different that we can't understand it, so different that it doesn't speak to us, that somehow we're severed from it, that it is not the headwaters of the society that we inhabit today. And I think that's the mistake that not just international relations scholars, who cares, but our culture generally. We look back to the Enlightenment, we look back maybe to the Reformation, and then we skip 1,000 or 1,500 years and we go back to Marcus Aurelius or the Romans or the Greeks. They have something to say to us. Again, 1,500 years where apparently there was no progress, no science, no political developments, no interesting characters, nothing, except maybe periodically Aquinas gets thrown around. But he was the tip of a very big iceberg.
Yeah, very, very much so. And you bring up an interesting point. You bring up the religious aspect, and especially for us here at Real Crusades History, obviously religion is always the omnipresent theme with the Crusades and with the crusading era, that has been either correctly interpreted or misinterpreted by various people pretty much ever since 1291 and kind of the end of the crusading phenomenon, at least as a presence in the Levant.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with his works at all, but he's a gentleman by the name of Andrew Willard Jones. He wrote a book called Before Church and State, that really focused heavily on, as his sort of archetypal example, he focused very heavily on the political and state mechanisms that were in place during the reign of King St. Louis IX of France in the early to mid 13th century. And reading people like him and others who they utilize these terms called, or they utilize these terms like confessional states or even sacramental states that existed in the medieval period. What role, as you see it, what was the role of organized religion, specifically Latin Christianity, which was the predominant faith during the medieval period, in terms of the state? Because often what we hear from the popular historians, especially the modern or postmodern commentators, is that they were almost something akin to a theocracy.
Yeah. Well, that's wrong. At least in Latin Christendom, you have the technical term is Caesaro-Papist state, the fusion of church and state in the Byzantine world, which of course the Byzantines referred to as the Roman world. But the separation of church and state was a long-run historical process in Latin Christendom that unfolded over many centuries, but really began pretty early on. By the time the 12th century Renaissance rolls around or kicks off, you've got in important places, England, France in particular, you've got titanic political struggles on the battlefield of ideas, but also on the real battlefield between church and state, right? Where is the locus of absolute supreme authority? Are there two separate domains, the temporal and the spiritual, that are subject to two different governing bodies, structures, people? It culminates in a sense, in the sort of titanic struggle between Boniface and Philip around the turn of the 14th century in France. And that gets resolved pretty decisively in what we would call the high to late Middle Ages, in favor of a separation of the temporal and spiritual. Now, does it look like the United States in 1776? No, it doesn't. That's not the point I'm making here, but the point I am making is that you can contrast the fusion of religious, the spiritual and the temporal in the Byzantine world, and indeed in the Islamic world, with a very different resolution to a conflict in what is now Western Europe, Latin Christendom. So that's kind of the first point I'd make about the conventional modern myth. And you have to ask yourself, why is the modern mind so obsessed with radically othering, if I can use that language, the medieval era? And it really does have to do with this idea that the Enlightenment was a new beginning for Europe, that we had discovered all this ancient, glorious knowledge, and that everything in between was religious, superstitious darkness. And of course, Protestant reformers would have put a Protestant Reformation twist to that and would have said this was an era of papalism and all the darkness that went along with that. So there's like I won't call it a conspiracy, but a conspiracy of interest. There were a lot of people who had an interest in portraying the Middle Ages, the medieval era, as dark and backward and beyond redemption. But if you spend 5 minutes seriously, if you can manage to put those prejudices aside and actually look at the real history of the region, you'll see that there was this separation of church and state that we inherited. We moderns inherited that and built on it, and now we're living with the consequences of that. And we can talk certainly about the role of religion in the Crusades, because that's a complex and vexed question as well.
From what you're talking about, what immediately comes to mind for me would be the investiture crisis and the outcome of that, and how at the Diet of Worms, it became very clear that this distinction between the religious and the secular, the church and the state, was very clearly defined, and that was in the 1130s.
That's right. And significantly there, if I can interrupt just for a second, is that the church initiated that reform. Right?
Yes.
It's the church that wanted to disentangle itself from the state, not the state trying to disentangle itself from the church. And in fact, that really does kick off this long-run historical process I've been talking about, which goes on for more than a few centuries and gets us to where we are today, ultimately. At least
So how then, in your own words, would you explain to perhaps somebody who all they've ever known is the popular historical narrative in contemporary times? How would you explain to someone the obvious, very deep religiosity that was present within all of medieval societies and permeated every level of their culture and every level of their society, with how they would think of as a separation of church and state, or how would they not be considered a theocracy?
Right. Well, to be sure, in the same way that, as the saying has it, fish don't know they're swimming in water, medieval people didn't realize they were swimming in an intellectual sea it just was the environment, this religious environment. They had no other way of understanding the world. But within that Christian context, different actors, whether they were political actors or their intellectual fellow travelers, had a lot of wiggle room, or as Canadians like to say, a lot of skating room. And so, for example, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's gets floated around a lot as the dualist thesis, that there are these two realms, spiritual and temporal, and that while kings can be judged, for example, for their personal sins, they have a direct grant of authority, either from God or from God through the people. Again, a complicated story. But for them, for the dualists, there was no need for a papal or priestly intermediary. It wasn't as if God deputized the Pope, who then deputized the temporal authorities. Now, there were people on the other side of this debate, this contention, who made exactly that claim, that that Peter was, the first vicar of Christ, and that all temporal power flowed from God through him and his successors, and that therefore temporal authorities were naturally subordinated to the church, and not just in matters of personal morality, but in political terms as well. And those were the two schools of thought, and different characters pop up and different arguments get made, but they are made, both sides could draw on. Remember, they didn't really rediscover all of Aristotle until the 13th century. Bits and pieces here, but not the political stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So they weren't really drawing on, they had some Cicero. My point is this: the wellspring for the arguments on both sides are natural law, the Christian natural law. They are scripture, right? They're the teachings of the church fathers. In other words, they're making, whether they're arguing for spiritual supremacy or for equality between the temporal and spiritual realms,
Mm-hmm.
they're making the argument using political languages which are ultimately derived from their religion.
I think that answers the mail. I would love to see anybody in the comments who maybe has some additional questions on this particular topic. Shifting the focus a little bit more specifically to the era of the Crusades, and what's interesting is that even in your title of Theorizing Medieval Geopolitics, you talk about war in the world order in the age of the Crusades.
Mm-hmm.
What particularly in the crusading era, which ultimately is defined by 1095 to the fall of Acre in 1291 ish, right. What in particular drew you to that period of history, that particular chapter of medieval history, in terms of geopolitics and international relations, like you've discussed?
Well, it seemed like the hard case to make, in a sense, because the conventional wisdom, again, is that these were, well, it depends. There's a couple of different storylines, one of which is the Marxist one. These are proto-imperialists, right? Just this is Imperial Europe of the 19th century projected backwards, and there was primogeniture was introduced, and the youngest sons had nothing to do but lots of energy, and they sought their fortune elsewhere, and so they went to the Holy Land, et cetera, et cetera. And then the other really predominant view, though, I think, is that this was all religiously motivated. And then there's my very good and smart students' view, which is nobody could take religion seriously. Are you kidding? It must be a smokescreen for something else. Nobody would actually do anything on the basis of religious conviction. And the truth is somewhere in that mix, and it's complicated, but here's how I resolved it, which is that if you separate the question of why kings went on crusade and why the Pope at Clermont proclaims the crusade, preaches the first crusade. If you separate that out from why individual crusaders signed up, then you begin to get some clarity. So there is no doubt that especially the early crusades, there were 9 numbered crusades. So, by about the 4th crusade, things are going a little bit off the rails, but the first 3 in particular, people mortgaged their properties. Lords mortgaged their properties to get to the Holy Land, to fight. And then they came back. And they didn't bring much. There was no material gain to be had. Let's put it that way. Now, some people stayed and some people made their fortunes, but that's the vast majority of that aristocratic warrior class signed up for religious reasons. And what were those religious reasons? Well, as I point out in the book, there's a conflict in the culture. On the one hand, there's the glorification of the warrior. And in Europe at that particular time, warrior culture involved all kinds of things which we would now were then called avarice and greed and sexual license, and the big one, killing other human beings. And then, so that's one kind of script which the lordly class internalized. And the other one was the Christian one, that, you need to be redeemed. You need to repent of your sins. And that's the only way you're going to get to heaven. Well, those two things don't fit together easily. And the first attempt to reconcile the two was to say, okay, repent and then kill no more. Well, that's hard for them to do because that's all that they do. That's their livelihood, as it were. So you're asking them to give up everything that makes them unique individuals with positions of power and prestige, etc., and then enter a monastery, let's say. Some people did that, but that wasn't really sustainable. And the church comes up with this brilliant idea. It wasn't some kind of conspiracy. This is the way things evolved. You can earn penance for your sins without giving up who you are as a warrior, but actually being a warrior, but a warrior in the service of Christ, not in the service of your own immediate superior or your king or whatever the case might be. This was a perfect solution for a lot of people. What do you mean? I get to be the greatest warrior I want to be, and I still get to heaven? That's a pretty good deal. Right?
It is.
Yeah. Then if you shift the focus and you ask, well, why is the Pope calling this? Why does he proclaim the First Crusade? Well, again, there's some geopolitics involved there. He's looking to reunify, if possible, East and West. He's getting these distress calls from the Byzantine Empire that, this is after the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. Turkic Muslims are on the march, literally through Christendom. But there's also a deep sense of injustice, right? This is the Reformed Church, right? You mentioned the investiture conflict, right? This is a church which is trying to get back to the basics, which is trying to be a force for good in the world, which is trying to live out Christ's mission, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the Islamic occupation, well, unlawful seizure, as they put it, of the Holy Land, which, of course, if you look at any map of Europe from this era, right in the center of it is Jerusalem. Right? That's how important it is in terms of the European geopolitical imagination. That is literally the center of the world. That needs to be reclaimed. So you get a religious impulse intersecting with a geopolitical impulse, and you've got a mechanism for mobilizing many, many people, many sort of average people, but also the warrior class. It's almost a perfect storm. You couldn't imagine that the Crusades wouldn't have happened. Right? And then they evolved. They figure out the rules a little more formally about who gets remission of their sins, or is it forgiveness of sins? I mean, there's a lot of theological stuff going on there that probably need not detain us. They work it out over time. I guess my basic point is this intersection of a deep spiritual religious impulse with a set of geopolitical concerns. You put that together, you get the Crusades.
No, that's really fascinating. I guess do you have any examples or just anything that other than obviously what you mentioned in terms of like just how they're perceived, but is there anything about the Frankish presence in the Levant or just the crusading phenomenon that from a geopolitical standpoint really defines that phenomenon and how it related to them in that particular time in history, in that era, and why it was such a priority to them, and why they would have been willing to sacrifice so much blood and treasure, or to steal Churchill's phrase, blood, sweat, toil, and tears, over something that from a purely utilitarian mindset was sort of a lost cause in a lot of ways for them.
It was a forlorn hope, I guess, to use a tried and true military metaphor. But one has to understand the religious temper of the times. I mean, Jerusalem and the Holy Land had been in Muslim hands for centuries at this point. It wasn't as if they had just been conquered and now this was a counterattack. It was often framed as a counterattack, but one that was, to put it mildly, in slow motion. There was a huge lag between the actual Islamic conquest and then the First Crusade in 1095. But the church was emerging from a period of decline and decay. It had been bound up pre-investiture controversy with very sort of mundane temporal politics. It had become corrupt in a sense. And the 12th century Renaissance, part of which was the revival of the church as a moral force, right? I don't want to romanticize this. It remains a political force, and it has its own mundane, this worldly interests, to be sure. But if you think of the kind of motivating impulses of the church leadership, one of them certainly is this renewed sense of moral purpose. And the sense of injustice at the loss, even though it had been centuries earlier, the loss of the land where Christ himself had walked, as they often put it, coupled with the prospect of reuniting the two parts of Christendom, right, the Orthodox and the Catholic, coupled with the threat of this other Islam, which seemed to be on the march again, right? It was pushing now into Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, in ways that threatened Latin Christendom. You put all of these together, so it's not just a religious impulse, but the religious impulse is not just a smokescreen or window dressing or some kind of propagandistic kind of tale told retrospectively. It mattered. It was what drove a lot of individual fighters, but it was also what drove the church. And then you say, okay, so the Pope proclaims crusade. Why did anybody listen? The receptivity argument. They listened because it made sense to them, given the religious temper of the times. And so now, again, let's not be naive. Power politics is at play here. Honor, fear, and interest is still at play, but there's this other piece in the mix as well, right? What it wasn't, and I maintain this really quite adamantly, what it wasn't was simply some imperial power grab, that there was money to be made, because that didn't appear that way at the time. This was a money-losing prospect. both at the individual level and at the level of the princes who led the first few crusades. So that's how I would put that. I think we need to try to inhabit the worldview of the people who were leading and the people who were led on the Christian side, and understand the multiple motives and impulses which interacted in a very specific way to get them to do what they did, which, by the way, nobody expected to succeed, and it was framed as a miracle, right, when Jerusalem fell in 1099, because nobody thought they would succeed.
What you talk about reminds me of possibly one of the best little quips of advice that I ever saw when it came to people who begin to study the medieval period. And unfortunately, I can't even remember who it was that originally said this, but they said if you approach the medieval period with modern tinted glasses, you will never understand the medieval period, because they were just so culturally, they were so different, and they just had such different priorities as a society and as a culture than we do today. That if you approach the medieval period with wearing the lenses of postmodern progressivism or post-enlightenment ideology, you will not understand them. They will seem impossibly alien and even hostile to those values, and you really have to take those lenses off in order to really understand where they were at that time in history.
I think that's right. And the most obvious example of that is in a way that I think is true for a vanishingly small minority of people in Western Europe and North America. The default setting was a widespread, deeply held, earnest belief that if you died without having your sins forgiven, you would really, literally roast in hell for all eternity. Now, if you really believe that, in the same way that I believe that, I need to breathe oxygen or I will die. If you really believe that, that's going to be a powerful motivator. There was a huge religious revival. I mean, I really do want to emphasize this. And it was a grassroots religious revival in the 12th, 13th century. And people really believed this. Not everybody, and not to the same degree. People are people. But the kind of factory reset was, we really believe that that's our fate. And that is a powerful motivator. It wasn't just the lordly warrior class that went on that first crusade. There was the children's crusade. There were a bunch of peasants' crusades. They were all slaughtered, of course. But they really wanted to be saved.
Yeah.
And the promise that was made to them was, if you make what they called the pilgrimage, the armed pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and you got there, your sins would, and here the language is a bit dodgy, but I'm just going to say your sins will be forgiven. And if you died on the way, your sins would be forgiven. And if you had to kill a bunch of people on the way, your sins would be forgiven.
Yeah.
Right. And so it really appeals to the warrior class, but not just the warrior class. But if you don't make that mental shift, if you look at it like religion is just a bunch of fairy tales that we tell children to frighten them into behaving themselves, then you're going to miss it. Then you're going to fall back on some Marxist, historiography, largely discredited Soviet intellectual explanations for the Crusades. But if you can inhabit their worldview just for 5 minutes, you'll see a whole different world comes into focus.
Yeah, I honestly, I don't feel like I've ever had a better explanation of that. I think we can probably shift to a couple of questions from the comment section right now. So we've got one from our listener who goes by the name of Deef. He says, when would you say did the Norman era come to an end? And the only reason I picked this question is because I think it has a lot to do with just the overall history of the crusading era, which the Norman era sort of preceded and in its early phases coincided with, where you had this phenomenon of the Norman adventurer who who went all across Europe and specifically more down towards the Mediterranean,
right?
In Sicily and Calabria, with the de Hautevilles and Robert Guiscard, and and then later, his son Bowman of Toronto, who would play such a pivotal military role in the First Crusade. What would you say would maybe not so much in terms of eras, because I'm not sure if there really is a Norman era, but how would you say that played into the crusading era and what it became, the Norman phenomenon?
Right. Well, you're right. The Norman, if there is a Norman era, it certainly predates the crusading era, and of course the Normans went just about everywhere, even if they didn't end up dominating everywhere that they went. But they certainly did play a major political role in, obviously, England and Normandy, but more importantly for our story, I think, in Sicily. And they play a really important role in terms of the evolution of states. It's a slightly different issue. The treason trials of various Norman leaders in Sicily really brings to the fore the issue of treason against whom, because you can only commit treason against the supreme political authority. And so is it the Holy Roman Emperor? Is it the king of Sicily? And so that helps to bring that question into focus and in fact resolve it in favor of kings as opposed to the emperor or the pope. All right, that's one set of stories. I think I by no means sort of focused my intellectual travels on the Normans, but I would say 1291 was the end of it. In that part of the world, it's the end of so much. And 1291 is, it's Acre Falls. It's the final extinguishing of the Latin Christian political presence in the Levant. There wasn't much left really from 1244 onwards. It was shrinking all the time. In my studies, the Normans figure much more prominently in terms of this history of the evolution of the sovereign state, because that's one of the major episodes. It's the treason trial of Robert of Sicily. Really does crystallize, answers the question definitively in the minds of many: where does the buck stop politically? It stopped with kings.
I hope that answer is what Deef was looking for. I would say our next question would be from our listener Josh Diaz, who asks, would you say the Crusades had more to do with politics than religion?
Both and, I'm afraid. At times, so let me nuance it, because I've said something about that already, that the initial impulse behind crusading was both. Then you have the establishment of the 4 Crusader states, and then by 1144 you're down to 3, because Edessa falls famously on Christmas Day, 1144, and it's never recovered. What does the geopolitical system in what we now call the Middle East look like? And it really is an overlap, an intersection of two different international systems, one of which is, let's just call it the European one, right? We can call it Christendom if you prefer. And here we have a bunch of political players. We have the Roman Empire, which we now insist on mislabeling the Byzantine Empire. We have kingdoms like England and France. We have Italian city-states, Genoa and Pisa. We have the Holy Roman Empire. We have a variety of other political units that are sort of attached to the empire, but not really, Sicily being an example I just mentioned. And then you have the Crusader states themselves. And they're all, if you think of them, now here I'm going against what I said a little bit earlier, if you just think of them as states, right? We can call them principalities if that makes people happier. They are all pursuing their own interests as they understand them. And those interests have to do with fear and interest and power. And sometimes they're working with each other in alliances, and sometimes they're fighting each other. The English and the French famously pretty much always, but not just them. And then on the Islamic side, you have various emirates, and at various different times, the Zengid empire expands and contracts, and the Ayyubids, and so on. And it's incredibly complicated. And those two world orders overlap in, what we would call the Holy Land or the Levant. And I think that we think sometimes that it was all crusade and jihad all the time, and that there was a civilizational divide. And on the one side, there were all these Christian states, and on the other side, there was various Islamic states. And that war defined the relationship between the two. It was always Christians versus Muslims, and it was either over religion or that was a smokescreen, and it was really over access to wealth, the Silk route to the Far East, which was well established at this point and very lucrative. And that's just not what was going on. There were conflicts within each of those civilizational blocks, if you want to call them that, those international systems. So within the Islamic world, there was lots of conflict. I mean, Saladin was at war with Muslims more than he was ever at war with Christians. Right? And it wasn't always about religion. Saladin was really the first one from 1095 until the middle of the 12th century. The notion of jihad was not an important factor in all of this. Saladin is the one, and depending on who you read, either cynically or because he truly believed that jihad had to be waged against these infidel Christians. And we know that, as I've just pointed out, that many Christian actors sometimes were motivated, powerfully motivated by these religious impulses. But think outside of the 9 numbered crusades, the day-to-day politics of the Crusader States, it looked a lot like, the relations between England and France. And sometimes there were alliances between Christian states and Muslim states against other Christian states and other Muslim states. That's probably an inelegant way of putting it, but you could have the enemy of my enemy as my friend kind of relationships. It's a very complicated story, which I told in the magazine Medieval Warfare a year or two back, about Zengid, the grandfather of Saladin. And all of the complicated geopolitics of that, which didn't easily map onto a Christian-Muslim divide, in which there were Christian principalities allied at certain points with Muslim principalities against other Christian principalities. It's incredibly complicated. Politics and religion. You can't make sense of the era without factoring in the real driving force of both sets of concerns.
So really, the answer sounds like both.
Both answers. Yep. Not even. And I could go into, just to muddy the waters, that the Marxists aren't entirely wrong. That the Italian city-states, Genoa and Pisa in particular, were in it for the money. These were very lucrative trade routes between the Far East and what is now Europe. And indeed, when Acre falls in 1291, alternative trade routes have to be found, which is why the Portuguese begin sailing around Africa.
Absolutely.
Which is why you have Genoans and Pisans in the Black Sea. And by the way, against
Crimea.
The backdrop of this COVID business, you might want to Google CAFFA, CAFFA,
That's right.
and find out how the Black Death was introduced to Europe as a result of the opening up of that particular alternative trade route.
Yeah, that's right. It's almost as if, shocking concept, there's no one aspect of fallen human nature that dominates human historical action in any way, shape, or form. It's maybe you just kind of have to understand humanity as a whole, and that yes, we are both idealistic, we are both cynical, we are both we are all things wrapped up into one, and
Yeah.
it's not any one aspect of our nature that comes out on top, which is where I feel like ideology falls short, especially modern ideology falls short, because it always grasps onto one particular aspect of human nature and says, "Oh, that's the reason why everything happens the way it does," and it falls short precisely for the reasons that you just mentioned. That no, we are very multifaceted beings. We are motivated by a wide variety of things. It's not just one thing or one thing above all. You can have people who are genuinely religious and yet be maybe motivated by more temporal concerns, but still genuinely feel like they are being faithful to those higher religious principles. It's not a zero sum game. It's not a black and white thinking kind of thing where it's like one or the other. It can be both.
Radical complexity is the name of the game, and we have to try to make some sense of it. So Thucydides, again, he says it's not one cause. It's not just fear. It's not just interest, and it's not just honor. It's all of those three things, and we could add probably a few more. You have to impose, as a scholar anyway, I get paid to impose some intellectual order what are very messy realities. And I spend a lot of time helping students come to that understanding that it is not just, class conflict. It is not just race this. It is not just religion that. These things interweave in very complicated ways, and people can make entire careers just pulling on one thread. And that's great. That's important. But I think of my job as a teacher, getting students to step back and say, no, there is this incredible complexity to this situation. It doesn't lend itself easily to our understanding after one course with Professor Latham, 1,000+ years after the fact, with none of us speaking medieval Latin or Arabic, and none of us have spent a lifetime. It doesn't matter if we had spent a lifetime in the archives. There are just too many of them. We could never manage. But we have to at least take a stab at understanding that complex situation. That involves boiling it down a little bit, simplifying it. But we should always bear in mind that as we're doing this, we're imposing, here I'm going to use a term that I hate, but I'm going to use it anyway. We're imposing a narrative structure on a complex story to make it simple. And my narrative structure is going to be different than the guy in the office next to me at college, or the guy at the medieval, the thing at Kalamazoo every year. That's just the way the world is.
Yeah. And it's the way the telling the story of history has always been. You can go all the way back to a Herodotus or a Thucydides or a Foucault de Chartres or a Raymond of Poitiers or a Froissart or a Petrarch. I mean, anybody who's ever been in the business of writing about history has their own take on it. And we are viewing that time through their lens, the lens that they've left behind and the lens that has survived to our time. Is it a perfect lens? Probably not. It's probably full of their own biases and their own personal quirks and rhetoric and etc. But it's what's left, and it's the job of the true historian to be able to not only view through the lens, but also recognize the lens with which he is viewing it through.
Yes.
And to be able to keep all of that in mind to come to hopefully some approximation of the actual reality of it.
Yeah, and to do that in a way that again is a ripping good yarn.
Oh, absolutely.
Which is a way of trivializing what's important, which is to make it accessible.
Yeah.
What you don't want to do, though, as well, is what Sir Stephen Runciman does when he writes his magisterial history.
Yes.
Which is to impose the narrative of the Second World War and the Holocaust, right? And to, he has a very disparaging mid-20th century, no, it's more than just mid-20th century, but it's a very disparaging idea of the West, right? And he's going to make his storyline fit that.
Yep.
And that is, we have to be on guard against that. Can we ever entirely inoculate ourselves against it? No. But I think we need to be honest. Where I am now, and I'm by no means paragon of intellectual virtue, but where I am now with respect to my understanding of the Crusades and the medieval era and its geopolitics is a million light years from where I would have been at the outset of my career, because I simply would have imposed some international relations models on that world. And it would have been like trying to fit, a size 3 shoe on a size 10 foot. I could make it work, but it wouldn't do justice to the topic. And I think that's where historians often, not always, but often have it over political scientists. Because political scientists like to say, look at something, the Crusades, and say, that is a case of what? And once you make that move, then you're in the realm of simplifying things. Oh yeah, that's the First World War was a case of world wars. The Second World War was a case of world wars. The Napoleonic Wars were a case of world wars. But you lose the nuance. You lose the texture of the phenomenon under consideration. And I don't call myself an historian. I'm trained as a political scientist, and I can't overcome that. But I do try to read things like the medieval era against the grain of my training as a political scientist, and to try to internalize some of the lessons of the historian, recognizing that historians have their own issues. They pretend they don't theorize when in fact they do all the time.
Yes. The one last question on this particular thread, and then we'll shift to where we'll close out. But it's from Elise83. She says, "I just want to say how much I've enjoyed this conversation." Absolutely, Elise. We're glad you've tuned in and listened in. But she asks, "How much did the Crusades and the Kingdom of Jerusalem influence the evolution of Western systems of government and society?"
That's a great question to wrap up this part of the session on. The Crusader States were unusual in that the Crusaders arrived, they conquered, and then they started with a blank sheet of paper. So if you think about the Kingdom of France or the Holy Roman Empire or Scotland or whatever, you've got these accretions of political developments that build up over time, and there's compromises, and there's this works, we don't really know why, we're just going to do it this way. That's not what happened. They actually had whatever they imagined the perfect states were, they kind of built them there. And so we can look at the Crusader States as the kind of crystallization of the highest imagining of what politics ought to look like. And so that's one way I would begin to answer the question. In terms of their long-run impact, they are not individually or collectively the center of gravity for the big debates. Those really are in Italy, especially with the exception of Sicily, which I talked about in a very specific context, especially where the Italian city-states and the Papal states are bumping up against the Holy Roman Empire and the area of overlap in northern Italy. Those debates are hugely consequential. Baldus and Bartolus and all of those great political thinkers of the 14th century, they're writing about that conflict. France versus the papacy is huge. And in terms of the evolution of sovereignty and the sovereign state as we know it and love it today, you can't understand that without paying attention to that conflict. The English and Bracton and the evolution of common law, but also the whole sort of political imagination of the English, later the British, later Empire, Commonwealth, later the United States, gets forged in this era. So that's really important as well. Except for that one, in my judgment, that one brief shining moment when they were created ab initio, almost, out of nothing, and therefore reflected the collective imagination of the West about what an ideal feudal Christian state ought to look like. I don't really see a lot of reciprocal effect on mainstream developments. With one exception. European states had to develop a taxation and a surveillance infrastructure, to use some technical language, in order to extract resources to fund crusades, right? And that had a lot to do with the way in which those states evolved. As I put it to my students sometimes, if you're going to, and they didn't, this is true later, but if you're going to draft every 18-year-old male, you got to have pretty good records about when they were born. Right. If you're going to tax people, you need to know how much they're making. And this is the way states evolve, as Charles Tilly, a famous political historian, puts it. States made war, and war made the state. And crusades factor into that as well.
I do find it interesting that one of the most seminal works on political theory from the high medieval period that there ever was, which was written by Thomas Aquinas. It was his tract De Regno on kingship, was framed as a series of letters to the king of Cyprus and Jerusalem at the time, which, by the time he was writing that, the kings of Cyprus, or the kings of technically Jerusalem, had already relocated to Cyprus. They were really de facto the kings of Cyprus, but they were still the de Lusignan, descendants of the original kings of Jerusalem. In fact, particular, Hugh de Lusignan, who had, Guy de Lusignan, who had married Sibylla, Queen of Jerusalem, in the context of the Third Crusade. So there was, at least in their time, there was a lot of, that still carried a lot of weight and a lot of cultural emphasis, that, this is obviously somebody that one of the greatest thinkers that the West ever produced wrote a series of tracts that later became one of his greatest political works. Or really his seminal work on political theory, as Thomas Aquinas' De Regno is now known. So there's that aspect of it, but I think you're absolutely right in that, in terms of the modern conversation, the Crusader states, other than maybe as curiosities, really don't factor very heavily in it all, and that's unfortunate. But I'm going to shift gears just a little bit, because I know I've kept you just over an hour, and I was hoping to keep you within an hour, but I do feel like it's fair for our listeners to hear about, aside from your work in geopolitics and international relations, you do have some other interests as well. And in fact, some of your efforts have been directed towards historical fiction with your Holy Lance series. And we even had a question from her name was Julia S. That asked, when is the second English Templar book coming out? So apparently you have people waiting for the continuation of your Holy Lance series, and if you could maybe go over that with everybody here, and just what exactly is your what is it exactly that you're doing in the realm of historical fiction?
Well, that was an exciting, I won't say detour, but again, once I fell into the trap of the Middle Ages, the medieval era, I mean, I just couldn't get out. I couldn't get enough, and I couldn't find an academic way to get at. One of the things I really wanted to get at was that these Knights Templar were real human beings, in some ways very much like us, but in some ways, as we've been talking, very different, right? And I don't know why. I must have just woken up one day and thought, I know, I'll do something I haven't done since 6th grade. I will write a work of fiction. And in 6th grade, it was a very short story about being trapped on a deserted island. So, I didn't really know what I was doing, but there are lots of resources out there. And I began to consume really good works of historical fiction. And the more you consume, the easier it is, for me, the easier it is to write. So I got a lot of things off my chest, and I found a publisher, pretty good publisher, which then went out of business.
Oh,
I like to say correlation, not causality at this point. They didn't go out of business because of me, but it left me a bit adrift. I'd already written several chapters of the sequel, which I thought was really good. And so I have been shopping it around, and I have to say that because I have a day job, which involves writing a lot of slightly more contemporary works. And also, I'm just finishing up a book on the evolution of the idea of sovereignty. So it's not like I've left the medieval behind, but it's been nonfiction that has been my focus for the last 3 or 4 years. But I have a couple of feelers out because I have a sabbatical coming up in a couple of years, I think. And sabbaticals are a wonderful time to indulge oneself. It's not a vacation, but you get to write what you want to write. And so I think the next one, I'll finish the next one. I imagine it'll be 7, 8, 9 chapters, and I've got 2+ already in the bag. So hope springs eternal and all that, but that is my plan. So if you are a publisher out there and you're listening to this and you want to publish my sequel, drop me a line.
That's good to hear. That it is still in the works. Just hopefully, or at the very least, to use a Thomistic term, in potentiality. That it is, it is still there, because apparently even Julia S responded just now. She said Holy Lance was awesome.
Oh, thank you very much.
You have some fans. You do have people out there who would like to see this continue, as would I, as someone who is also dabbling in historical fiction. Although I long ago left the Crusading era with historical fiction. I'm actually more focused on the 100 Years' War period for my stories, which is
also fertile. Also fertile.
Yeah, and I'm there's a part of me that is just very captivated by the whole, as Cliff Rogers would characterize it, the whole midwife of the European nation state thing with the 100 Years' War, and that it was the great war of its time. But that, and also I just love the idea of the English longbow and on the battlefield, and not so much the weapon, but more the men who wielded it, the English archer, the simple yeoman who went out and shook all of Europe without even really meaning to do so. No, this has been a fantastic interview. Dr. Latham, thank you so much for coming on here and being our very first live stream guest interview. as we launch this channel, we hope to have many more interviews like this, where our listeners can ask questions. Hopefully the timing works out with everybody. Hopefully we'll get some constructive feedback on how it works for everyone. But at the end of the day, really all I can say is, on behalf of Real Crusades History and all the fans and listeners that we have, thank you, Dr. Latham, for taking the time to be with us tonight. And hopefully we'll see you back soon.
It was my pleasure, and anytime.
Okay. To all our listeners, thank you for tuning in wherever you are. I hope you have a good night, or a good morning, or a good rest of your day, depending on what time zone you're in. And we will see you again very soon. And we hope to bring you much more content like this in the future. So this is us signing out for now, and we will see you again.